You are listening to KPFA, KPFB in Berkeley, KFCF 88.1 in Fresno, K248BR 97.5 in Santa Cruz, and online at kpfa.org.
Welcome to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman. Jeff Fawcett and I come to you weekly with a critical, independent voice on the politics and practice of health and the environment.
Single-payer medical care is back on the political agenda as Medicare-for-all. It's extremely important that we have it. It's so important, I think it's a litmus test for any elected official. However, Medicare-for-all isn't enough. That's because, as we said 10 years ago in our book, Too Much Medicine, Not Enough Health, when single-payer was a live issue that was strangled by Barack Obama, single-payer, now Medicare for All, is intended to solve a financial problem. Only by implication does it solve any health or medical problem. I say by implication because the assumption is that with single-payer or Obama's Affordable Care Act or Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All, those who cannot now afford medical care can receive it, and with access to medical care, people's health will improve. That implication is a fallacy that was characterized by the social critic Ivan Illich as obvious, well-documented, and well-repressed. I'll have more to say about Illich later, but for now, I want you to keep clearly in mind that Medicare for All is a reform of medical insurance, but not a reform of medical practices. The existing system of medical practices includes medical professionals, such as doctors, nurses, and pharmacists, medical institutions, such as the National Institutes of Health, the American Medical Association, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, medical businesses, such as drug companies, medical device manufacturers, and hospitals. The existing system excludes a wide swath of both conventional and alternative medical practices. More about that in a moment. But I pause here to note, as the title of our book, Too Much Medicine, Not Enough Health suggests, medical care and health care are not the same thing. Health care is what keeps you out of medical care. Or, if you wanted to be generous, you might say that medical care is a minor aspect of health care. But as when the War Department became the Defense Department, the medical system has branded itself as the healthcare system, and hence the illusion that Medicare for All is a solution to our health problems. Medicare for All is not and cannot be a health solution without other changes to what Medicare for All would pay for. For example, paying for homeopathic remedies or paying for an organic, non-GMO diet. What I want to focus on now is the assumption that greater access to medical care will improve overall health. I'm going to argue not only that it will not, but that Medicare for All is likely to make people's health generally worse. And then I'm going to argue that there is hope for something better that doesn't depend on the machinations in institutions far away. I want to start by doing a little framework of this by repeating that there is a difference between health and medicine. Health is actually what Illich calls a capacity to adapt so that you have a decent life, as we put in the book. Health is about living a good life. Medicine is what you do when something impairs on that, and specifically something that goes wrong with your biology. There are lots of other things that can go wrong that are environmental, but medicine specifically has to do with your biology being interrupted, interfered with, damaged. The other distinction I would like you to keep in mind in this discussion is that personal health is not the same as population health. So that, for instance, there is no doubt that Medicare for All will increase access, and with that access will prevent some people from being harmed. However, some other people will be damaged by the medical practices to which they have been given access. I can see this in discussions of Medicare for All, where people speak eloquently and passionately about access being denied to a loved one and that person dying or being harmed by it. These are horror stories that access is denied by current for-profit insurance, and as a consequence, people believe loved ones have died. The important thing to remember is because you know of an instance where someone's life was saved by access to medical care or whose life was taken, you think, by lack of access to medical care, I would claim, and I'm going to discuss why, far more people are harmed by access to the medical system. I am not arguing against access. I am not arguing against Medicare for All. I believe Medicare for All is absolutely essential. I think everyone should have access to medical care. What I am asking is, what is it we are demanding access to? What is it that we are getting when we get access to medical care? I think there is substantial reason to believe that what we're getting access to is not enough. The other thing that I would like you to keep in mind is that the current private insurance system excludes some practices and it sanctions others. Its gatekeepers are the medical professionals of a particular kind. Private insurance system pays for medical services, but it only pays for certain medical services, and access is controlled through both individual health professionals, through sanctioned diagnoses, and sanctioned treatments. You don't get any old diagnosis, you don't get any old treatment, you get what is available. I'm reminded of the famous quote from Henry Ford when someone asked him what colors you could get a Model T in, and he said, you can get any color you want as long as it's black. Well, once you have insurance, you can get any medical care you want as long as the insurance company approves of it. And the insurance company, obviously, because it's a for-profit enterprise, or most of them are for-profit enterprises, means that it's interested in minimizing costs, so that they will be looking for the most expedient solutions to medical problems, and they will deny insurance claims based on that motivation. Medicare for All doesn't change that power dynamic at all. It solves the financial problem of providing greater access so that you and your loved ones will be able to have medical care, but there will still be denials. Care will be denied if it does not conform to currently accepted practices of medical care. So instead of it being a financial decision on the part of insurance companies, Medicare for All will make it apparently a political decision fundamentally, but the political decision is a financial one because there will be great pressure, political pressure, to minimize costs of the program. And we see that even now with calls for reductions in expenditures in Medicare, to cut Medicare costs and put more of the financial burden for the costs of the system onto individual people. This is about expectations, this thing of what we expect Medicare for All to do, what problems we expect it to solve, and how we expect it to be better in terms of denial or gaining access to medical care. It is not about false promises per se. No one's misrepresenting Medicare for All as a solution to what is declining health in this country and in all industrialized countries. So again, absolutely, we should have Medicare for All or something like it. What you'll need to learn is how to use that system effectively, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. Because of greater access through Medicare for All, some will benefit, some will not. If you think carefully about it, that's pretty obvious. The insurance system is a rationing system. It is intended to prevent access to some people. If it's designed as Medicare for all is being proposed, it will increase access for some people. Population health, in general, the argument is that has increased because of insurance. We've actually presented people who have researched this. What comes immediately to mind is an interview I did with Ginny Lenzer about medical device manufacturers and how the availability of insurance actually increased the damage that was done by the availability of medical devices, a wide range of medical devices. For example, hip replacements. The name of her book is The Damage Within. The logic of this makes sense. The greater access you have to a risky environment, the greater your exposure to risks to the medical system that causes more suffering than healing and works against health. And that brings me back to this notion of we should be thinking not about medical care, but actual health care. More of that later. I want to illustrate the point that I'm making about how the medical system causes harm by using the example of the opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic comes from the application of pain management, which is an accepted medical practice covered by insurance companies. It's an integral part of the medical system. In some respects, it is the medical system within the context of private insurance and other institutions working at its best. The opioid epidemic, to give you a little summary here of how it developed, is the result of pain management causing or facilitating addiction to opioids. It has resulted in the decline in the life expectancy of middle-aged white Americans due to opioid addiction and subsequent effects of that on their life, including increased suicides, from which people of color have been excluded because of medical racism. And here's something to hear very carefully. One of the things that brought my attention to this issue in the first place is the fact that it is having a disproportionate effect on white middle-aged Americans, that people of color are not experiencing that decline in life expectancy in that age range. More of that later. This is an anomaly. Medical outcomes are worse for people of color as compared to whites. Here is an instance which you may think makes the opioid epidemic a counterexample of that relationship. And actually, I think it is a very clear example because it comes from discrimination by race in the medical profession, and this is well known. And it illustrates that discrimination actually amplifying the damage that is done in the medical system, outweighing the benefits. And again, I'm not saying that every contact or every encounter or every experience in the medical system is a bad one. I am not saying that allopathic medicine should be ignored. What I'm going to be saying is that, in fact, the scope of medical care should be broadened and not simply narrowed on allopathic medicine. There's more to it than that, but that's the general direction. In addition to a decline in life expectancy of middle-aged white Americans, there's also, if you scratch the surface of this phenomenon, you find out that, you discover that there's been a decline in a broad range of health indicators across age groups and racial groups, so that looking beyond the opioid epidemic, there has been a general decline in health, again, not medical outcomes, but health, and a rise and increase in suffering. You're listening to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Jeffrey Fawcett. I'm talking today about how Medicare for all is not enough to solve our health problems. Let me talk a little bit about pain management. Management is not neutral. I believe that there are alternative medical professionals who engage in pain management, but I would like to refer you to a recent show that Lena did, which is titled Pain as a Symptom, and the title, in a way, tells you all that you need to know about the general concept of what she talks about in that show, which that pain is a symptom of something. It is not the pathology itself. So that the impetus for healthcare and medical care, in this case, medical care for pain, is that the purpose, the goal should be to find out what's not working right and fix it. Pain management starts as a treatment of a system, but it quickly becomes the pathology itself. And I'll discuss this in more detail, but I'm going to do so based on a series of articles in a book by a Guardian writer. It's in the newspaper, The Guardian. The series is written by Chris McGreal, M-C-G-R-E-A-L. One article is called How Big Pharma's Money and Its Politicians Feed the U.S. Opioid Crisis. Another article is called The Making of an Opioid Epidemic. And the first one I mentioned comes out in 2017. The next one comes out in 2018. And also in 2018, he publishes the book American Overdose, The Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts. What he describes is begins with the hospice movement in the United Kingdom and its palliative use of morphine in terminal cases. And that hospice movement is extremely progressive. It's humane. It's a really good movement. Much was learned by that, and it was from that practice, and it was brought to the United States, except not in the context of hospice, because the hospice movement in the United States at the time was primitive at best. But what it was used and applied to was cancer treatment. From treatment of cancer cases, use of morphine, and subsequently other opioid painkillers spreads to the use of other pain events. As McGreal points out in his articles and in his book, the adoption of the use of morphine and narcotics as medical applications was very much an uphill battle because of draconian drug policies that were established as far back as the beginning of the 20th century. There's a whole history behind why that happens. So this was not an easy thing to do, and these advocates for the use of palliative painkillers fought very hard to have them accepted as a standard medical practice. And the practice was promoted from 2 directions. One was that there was a growing prevalence of pain, of chronic pain in particular. The second, that was how this use was promoted, was that a body of science emerged that said that someone who's in chronic pain, who is in extreme pain, it can't become addicted to a painkiller. It's because of how the receptors work, that the painkillers take up the receptors and the body doesn't, once the source of the pain is gone, then the body goes back to a steady state. It does not, use of the painkillers does not develop dependency by them. So pain management becomes a standard practice in medical care. And in fact, there was a physician in Britain, who was the center of some of this. I think she was even brought to the United States to work in one of the universities in promoting pain management based on her experience in the hospice movement in the UK, who was a great advocate and wrote extensively on how painkillers were not addictive. Opioids were not addictive when used in the context of pain management, who has now learned that, in fact, they are addictive and is now one of the major voices in opposition to widespread use of opioids and in taking care of the opioid epidemic. Once that happens, Big Pharma, as the first article from Chris McGreal notes, Big Pharma moves in. They saw money opportunities, and so they start developing more powerful narcotics, and that starts amping up the dosages and what can be solved and the need for or the addictive power of those drugs. As one would expect, with that increasing interest, there's an increasing influence over the medical practice of pain management itself. So Big Pharma is in the middle of this picture. The insurance industry is in the middle of this picture because the insurance industry, as I mentioned earlier, is interested in the quick fix. Going back to the show that Lena did, her show, Pain is a Symptom, one of the things she discusses extensively is that very often pain and even palliative care for pain involves extensive work. Sometimes it is work involving body work, and sometimes it is extensive work with a healthcare practitioner in figuring out what the cause of the pain is. Much easier from the health insurance company's standpoint to prescribe a drug. Not to mention that there is great collusion between the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance industry. But the major impetus is cost minimization. Insurance companies do not want physicians who are very expensive spending lots of time counseling and figuring out what to do about the actual causes of pain. And this system failed. And McGreal goes into considerable discussion of how this system failed. How did all these three moving parts, the pain management of medical practices and the acceptance by medical institutions of pain management, the development from Big Pharma of a material interest in selling more increasingly powerful pharmaceutical opioids, narcotics, painkillers, and the insurance industry, which had which both in collusion with the pharmaceutical companies, have a great interest in minimizing the payouts so that they approve of therapies that use, called the quick fix, the least cost solution, which is to give a drug, prescribe a drug instead of to provide, for instance, body work or careful analysis of the cause of what's actually causing this increase, this epidemic of chronic pain. And in fact, what this should be called is not the opioid epidemic, but the chronic pain epidemic. So what failed? Well, first, the science was wrong, not through anyone's bad intentions, but they were simply wrong. They made a mistake, and they didn't recover from it. They didn't correct the mistake. The mistake kept on being made. The insurance industry rewards and continued to reward the least cost solution. No one's paying attention to the actual effectiveness of the spending, because as all of this is cranking up, more and more people are in chronic pain, and the therapies become less and less effective. The medicine fails to correct the mistake. medical institutions fail to correct the mistake. The patients become addicted. Then access is cut off or limited, very often through the insurance industry. Coverage is stopped. The medical practice moves ever more to treating the symptom. It's pain, more drugs to treat the pain. And the standard of care does not itself change. That pain is now firmly established as the pathology. Somewhere, you might think, regulatory intervention, or non-intervention in this case, should have pushed this along. But the thing that I have discussed many times about regulatory intervention or regulatory control over health and medical practices is that these institutions are captured by the industries and institutions that they are nominally set up to regulate. Moreover, just institutionally, it's not their job to ensure, to find or to correct medical mistakes and establish medical practices. What they exist for is to maintain the existing order, what's established by best practices as established by the insurance industry based on what therapies are available, principally driven by pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers. And those two, the business part and the medical institutions part, is what's driving regulatory action or non-action. Their job is to monitor the industry and institution, not to change them. Then, of course, we have pharmaceutical companies which collude with insurance industries and collude with the medical institutions and carry great weight in terms of what is acceptable, what is sanctioned. Missing from all this is, why is there an increasing prevalence of pain? One version of this is that it is both pain management and the epidemic of chronic pain is part of a generalized assault on the working class. This is from an article called Genocide by Prescription, The Natural History of the Declining White Working Class in America by James Petrus and Robin Eastman Abaya, who is an MD. James Petrus is quite well, in my circles, quite well known for his work, particularly on U.S. imperialism, and is very much a social activist. Petrus and Eastman Abaya have a specific argument that they're focused on about elimination of the surplus population, that is, people who've been made redundant because there's actually no useful work for them to do. That article is useful for opening our eyes to the fact that, and it is well known, that there is a generalized assault on the conditions of work. Protections of workers and working conditions is abysmal and getting worse. There's a direct assault by the forces of darkness to not make working conditions safe because it's expensive. And there's also the declining power of the working class, of the union movement, to actively promote safety in the workplace. No one, of course, is keeping statistics on this because no one wants to ask that question. I mean, yes, there are occupational and safety statistics out there, but they're not particularly telling, and there is a general undermining of that. I remember vividly, this is from several years ago when I was looking into this issue, that just the collecting of occupational safety statistics in California, they aren't taken. They used to during the 50s and 60s. They were taken and then they were cut off. They were cut off because there were statistics showing up that were uncomfortable. And so we see this, again, regulatory capture raises its head so that if you don't have a number, if you don't have statistics on how workers are being harmed, well, then there's not a problem. It's just he said, she said, and it becomes an episode on Fox News. So in addition to assaults on the working class and not only working class as workers, but also as consumers in terms of product safety. There is increase in assaults on the nervous system from environmental toxins, environmental assaults. I, of course, would be remiss not to say something very explicit about the exposure to radio frequency radiation and electromagnetic fields that are well known. And we've talked about that endlessly on this program. Very recently, I interviewed Martin Paul on this very topic. That interview and his work is a final piece in terms of the causal chain, because it's been widely observed scientifically that there's a wide range of neurophysiological effects of exposures to electromagnetic fields generally, and radio frequency radiation in particular, which is the form of radiation used in wireless technologies. Yet another that I will only mention briefly, about which there is a lot of activism, is that there are neurotoxins that are essential ingredients in the formulation of personal care products, particularly scented products. And pesticides are very often neurotoxic as well. I'm going to take a brief musical break. When I come back, I'll continue talking about how Medicare for All, despite its virtues, could make our health worse. So stay tuned. You are in the right place. Welcome back. This is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Jeffrey Fawcett. I'm talking today about the limits of Medicare for All. Our website, yourownhealthandfitness.org, has more information about this show, as well as our almost 700 other shows, a free download of today's show, free open access to recordings of all our shows, a free newsletter about upcoming shows, and more at yourownhealthandfitness.org. So I was just referring to one of the big things in this discussion that is missing from the dominant dialogue on the opioid epidemic and pain management is that what the source of this increasing prevalence of chronic pain is. What I want to move on to now is a discussion of what the consequences of this is, because pain management is really a best case for how the medical system works. So let's talk first about the lowering of life expectancy in middle-aged whites. I was alerted to this several years ago by an article called Rising Morbidity and Mortality in Midlife Among White Non-Hispanic Americans in the 21st Century. And this is by Ann Case and Angus Deaton, who are not medical writers, but who are economists. And they were asking, why is this going on? Why is this trend in midlife for white Americans happening? They note, for instance, that this is contrary to the trend for people of color, which they attribute to, they don't call it medical racism, but to discrimination. Withholding of treatment causes harm, but here is an instance where withholding of treatment actually caused a health benefit. They also note that the effect is unique. This decline in life expectancy in middle-aged whites is unique to the United States, which they seem to ask, does that mean the problem is in medical insurance, which Chris McGrill in his article seems to imply that the reason why you don't see this happening, this white middle-age decline happening in Europe is they have universal health care. The answer seems to be, no, that's not the issue, that this actually is just a exaggeration of the medical system working as it does. They pack into this research article, these Case and Deaton, a number of other things which indicate beyond decline in this one marker of expected life expectancy for middle-aged Americans. They start looking at health indicators generally. And in all classes, in all races, what they see is a steady rise for all classes in deaths from poisoning, suicide, and cirrhosis. Poisoning is the category in which overdoses are counted, and that's what many of the deaths from the opioid epidemic are from, people becoming addicted and overdosing. And they do not distinguish between overdosing as suicide or overdosing as accident. And again, this is a consequence of pain management, so that were it not for pain management, some of those deaths would not have occurred, but they are treated as separate issues from the inciting event of pain management treated through use of narcotics. So there are a broad number of other quality of life measures that they show declining, that is, Case and Deaton, and those findings are consistent with research that I came across almost 10 years ago in an article called Mortality and Morbidity Trends. Is There Compression of Morbidity by Eileen Crimmins and Hiram Beltran-Sanchez. That article argued that while life expectancies are increasing a little bit, they continue to increase, although it's pretty much stagnated, that what has actually happened is that if one subtracts medical interventions that have extended life but have simply papered over disabilities, so that if you actually count extended life minus years of infirmity from the end of life, you actually get fewer years of healthy life that people are living. They record this as having gone on for basically 2 decades, that life expectancy of healthy years is declining. So the medical system is able to keep the body running, but at the same time, the health of that body declines. And remember, health is the basis. Health is what keeps you out of the medical system. So the medical system, by that measure, is actively making life worse. The opioid epidemic is only more dramatic, but it is business as usual. What has failed here in the opioid epidemic, and more generally as the paradigm for how the medical system works, is that business is at the core of medicine, and both businesses as in pharmaceutical companies and hospitals, but business as in how the scientific institutions work. That scientific ignorance and fallibility is at the core of this failure because of the failure to correct mistakes when they are discovered. There is the failure of regulatory capture for public agencies to intervene adequately in those failures. And the bottom of this is the failure to identify and act on the actual causes of pain. And that's of a piece with the attack on the working class that's been going on since the 1950s and been obvious since the 1970s. But you will think, but wait a minute, our lifespan has increased over the last 150 years, hasn't it? The conventional wisdom is that medicine, the medical system, has been responsible for that. What they've actually done is they've taken credit for it as opposed to being responsible for it. It is not what much of the data suggests. I refer you to 2 books. One's called Dissolving Illusions, Disease, Vaccines, and the Forgotten History by Suzanne Humphreys and Roman Bystrianic. And the other is Ivan Illich's book, Limits to Medicine, Medical Nemesis, The Expropriation of Health. In both of those books, Illich's book goes on, and actually I'm going to discuss it soon, much more broadly, but both of them point out, because this is the standard thing that's trotted out, that medical science has vanquished infectious disease, or did so in the early 1900s. And in fact, both of these books argue, and Humphrey's book, Dissolving Delusions, quite eloquently and conclusively, that's simply not the case. That declines in infectious disease, including polio and measles, over which everyone is blindly hysterical right now, that all declined well before any antibiotic or vaccine was ever introduced. And there's even a considerable history over the fact that the first vaccine to be introduced was for smallpox, and that even there, smallpox incidence was declining, and before the vaccines were introduced and put on a mass scale. And I'm not talking marginal things about, there was a decline of 10%. We're talking about declines that are in the 90% range. 90% of infectious diseases incidence disappeared before, for instance, measles vaccines were introduced. So modern medicine, I think of it as industrial medicine, the sanctioned medicine of the current medical system can't legitimately take credit. And even Illich has, again, an eloquent argument in his book regarding this. Where the improvements came from, the reason why these infectious diseases declined and why other maladies declined, is that the working class, the labor movement, empowered itself and fought for things like better working conditions, so environmental exposures got reduced, and fought for better nutrition, were able to afford better food, and again, improved their health. So that it is improvements in health that brought about these declines, these paradigms of decline in incidence, deaths and incidence of infectious disease, and other maladies. I think of workplace injuries, which again is being assaulted with assaults on the National Labor Relations Board and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. In fact, early in the labor movement contained many physicians who were advocates for public health and got many of the public health initiatives brought into being, such as for sanitation and water purity. Subsequently, the public health profession is still highly motivated by social justice issues, but its technical aspects, in many respects, have been captured. A kind of regulatory capture has been captured by the medical profession, so that public health is an extension of medical practices, so that one of the major things of public health is vaccinations, which is a medical practice, not a public health practice. And that capture is described in a book called The Social Transformation of American Medicine by Paul Starr. I want to move on to Ivan Illich, who introduces a notion, iatrogenic pathology. Iatrogenic is a word that means caused by the healer. It is generally associated these days, although it could be both for good and for bad, it generally refers to bad outcomes. Illich starts his book, "The medical establishment has become a major threat to health." And he goes on to say that he's writing this book not to reform, but to critique those institutions, health institutions. It goes on to offer a framework for the social organization of health and healing. Iatrogenesis, that's spelled iatrogenesis, is pathology, that is death, illness, injury, suffering, that is the result of medical practice. It has now made its way into the medical literature, although not into official statistics. The CDC doesn't report on it, but there is an article that was published by researchers from Johns Hopkins Martin McCary and Michael Daniel, called medical error the third leading cause of death in the United States. The first three, according to the CDC, are heart disease with 635,000 deaths per year, cancer with 600,000 deaths per year, and third, a somewhat distant third, unintentional injuries with 160,000. This article by McCary and Daniel calculates, by looking carefully at the research, that medical mistakes account for 250,000 deaths per year. That's 250,000 people, putting it in a solid third place. There's another documented source from an interesting website called Our Civilization that is called Table of Iatrogenic Deaths in the United States, who they very carefully and detailed go through a wide range of research on medical mistakes, iatrogenic deaths in the United States, and the number they come up with is 1 million. Well, it's a little bit less than 1 million, but 1 million's nice round number, which puts it very solidly as the number one cause of death. You're listening to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Jeffrey Fawcett. I'm talking today about how Medicare-for-all is not enough to solve our health problems, that we need to solve our health problems directly. Illich goes beyond this. They might be mistakes, but they aren't accidents. They are the effect of medical practice. This is friendly fire. We see this in other areas in the literature, so that, for instance, there's increasing talk of off-target effects rather than side effects. That side effects aren't accidental, they're just mistakes. Oops, we didn't mean to cause you to lose your memory because you're taking statins. That's a side effect. No, it's an effect. It's just an off-target effect. It's not the effect that you want. Illich talks about three forms of iatrogenesis. There's medical mistakes, medically caused mistakes, clinical iatrogenesis, social iatrogenesis, and cultural iatrogenesis. Clinical are those things that we've just been talking about, what's described as medical mistakes: death, illness, disability. Social iatrogenesis is politics and institutions that create medical dependence, over-medicalization, what he calls in his subtitle to his book, expropriation of health. Remember, health is what keeps you out of medical care. So the focus of attention in terms of medical care and Medicare should be on health, not medicine. Medicare-for-all itself is going to do exactly this. It is a form of social iatrogenesis. That is, it gives you access to approved form of medicines. It gives you access to approved forms of treatment. It gives you access exclusively to approved medical treatment. And again, I remind you of Henry Ford, anything you want as long as it's black. The question I think you should be asking is access to sanctioned medical care really what you need? If you're in pain, do you need a drug? Or do you need someone to help you work out what's causing the pain? Would you be better served by other forms of medicine, homeopathy, herbalism, traditional Chinese medicine? Would you be better served by health services rather than medical services? Health services, which we don't have. No advanced industrial country actually has health services. I'm not talking about water purification and sanitation. I'm talking about better nutrition, by which I do not mean sanctioned by the USDA or similar institution, but better nutrition such as organic, non-GMO foods, better housing, better environmental health, meaning fewer toxins and fewer toxicants. How would you know what was better in terms of health services? Where's that information come from? When you call for help, who shows up and what do they do? So the politics and structure of medical dependence, what's available? There's cultural iatrogenesis, which the politics and institutions that turn health into an engineering problem, subordinating or destroying the capacity for traditional autonomous communal forms of health and healing, as described by Illich. Think of it as cultural, as being branding of the medical system as where you get health. Remember that War Department becomes Defense Department. Medical care becomes health care. That's a branding change. That tells you what's normal. And that is what Medicare promises. That is the expectation that it sets, that greater access will give you better health. Birth, development, aging, healing, recovering, death are branded as medical conditions and treated that way. We have become conditioned to what is normal. So what are the solutions here? Illich describes a solution as the promotion of health as a process of adaptation, the capacity to adapt within a culture, or a culture that enables those adaptations. We do have a culture which provides a process of adaptation, but it's subordinated to medicine. Health is subordinated to medicine. The opioid epidemic is an illustration, an environmental problem that is what's causing, and I mean both work environments and natural environments and home environments are the problem that have been turned into a medical problem and treated with pain, treated as the pathology and not a symptom of the environmental pathology. Illich goes on to say that the best conditions for health are a society with the least need for professional medical intervention. And I say it is the society that has the greatest capacity to correct its mistakes, both the mistakes in applying a medical practice and in the standards that define medical practice. That requires reconditioning and self-conditioning. It is something we have been conditioned into. We need to recondition ourselves and do it ourselves with self-care personally and communally, because it's not something that you can do on your own. It's something you have to do both for yourself and with other people, with the people with whom you share a way of life, not distant in institutions. Institutional change, such as Medicare-for-all, is unlikely to provide a solution. Institutions are people doing their job, not living their life or a life. Doing a job is defined by and serves whatever institution the job takes place in. If you work, your own experience confirms this. You are serving not the customer, although it may be framed that way. You are served by what the institution says the customer needs, wants to provide the customer, says what the customer deserves, what they can have. Even in the context of health and healing, most people in the healing professions aren't involved in healing. And in fact, it's a misnomer to say that medical professionals are healers, because it's your body that heals, and your body heals because it's in good health. And it is because the medical professional supports that health that your body is able to heal. In medicine, you, as the patient, are the object, the raw material. The customer is who pays the bills for the person doing the job in the institution. So for you, institutions are things to navigate, and those are the skills, the capacities to develop, to recondition yourself around. Self-care within the communal context is on a human scale, and that is where you find the solutions. On the whole concept of human scale, there's a book by Kirkpatrick Sale called Human Scale Revisited. So this is all about how much control you have. To contrast personal control with communal control, I want to take you back to 2008 when the Medicare-for-all, the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act was being concocted, and it was during the presidential campaign an active topic of discussion of having not only single payer, but reforms of how medical services were provided through how universal health care worked. I was involved with the discussion with people in some who were trying to influence some policy positions of presidential campaigns of something that really sought to reform how medical practices were affected by medical care. And that was to open up care to anything, any kind of medical practice. And it was entirely based on patient choice. How that system would work, it would be a voucher system. You'd get a limited number of meta dollars or something. I don't even know if they had a name for it at the point. You could use your vouchers to pay for organic, non-GMO food. You could use your vouchers to pay for homeopathic remedies. You could, or alternatively, you could use your vouchers to go to a medical clinic. Any way you want, and track would be kept of what the outcomes were, so that in the future, as this system worked, everyone would be able to see what works and what works cost effectively. Interesting idea, never even saw the light of day, for reasons which I'm sure you can understand. Contrast that system with what worked in the case of the opioid epidemic, which is the system that Medicare-for-all would implement. That's the system, and it won't protect you against the medical system that produced the opioid epidemic and the decline in life expectancy. So the contrast here is between institutional control and what I've called personal and communal control, what even Illich calls autonomous self-care, and communal self-care, or community self-care, community-based self-care. The path to that is a contrast to a system based on professional medical providers, to a system in which you are at the center, you both individually and communally. And I recommend that you look at two organizations. One is famous for its nutrition work, but it does much broader. And the other is famous for its environmental work. Both of these are actually international organizations, but they are based on local chapters, small single cells taking up individual focused issues. One's the Weston A. Price Foundation at westonaprice.org, and the Community Environmental Defense Fund, CELDF.org. These are organizations consisting of people working locally with the support of a broader organization. But the focus of organization is people organizing themselves, supporting themselves, providing personal health, environmental health, and providing resources that will help them navigate the institutional environment. With regard to navigating institutional forces, these organizations and you yourself need to learn how to talk back to institutions, how to say no, and how to learn how to be well informed so that you can say no. Medicare-for-all isn't going to solve your health problems. You are. And let me end by saying that the situation is neither hopeless nor entirely bad. The medical system does do some things right, even with all medical options available. It's just not enough. The capacity to navigate institutions is essential based on health, not treatments, among people with whom you share a life. And let me say, finally, support Medicare-for-all. Thanks for joining us today. Visit our website, yourownhealthandfitness.org, for information about this show and almost 700 other shows. Free access to recordings of all of them, a free newsletter about upcoming shows, and more. Your Own Health and Fitness is produced by Lena Berman and Jeffrey Fawcett. Until next time, take care of yourself.
Remember his fiercely honest writing from Gaza? Max Blumenthal, author of Goliath and Republican Gomorrah, is now coming to Berkeley with a blazing new book, The Management of Savagery, How America's National Security State Fueled the Rise of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Donald Trump. This is a thoroughly damning indictment of our bipartisan national security apparatus. Max will be hosted by Nora Barros-Friedman of the Electronic Intifada and Flashpoints. This KPFA benefit will be Thursday evening, April 25, at First Congregational Church, 2345 Channing Way in Berkeley. There's wheelchair access. Tickets at brownpapertickets.com and supportive indie bookstores. That's for Max Blumenthal, April 25th. Don't miss it.
You're listening to